Rain drove down hard over Dunn's Crossing that afternoon, hammering tin roofs and turning the main street into a stretch of mud thick as glue. Folks pressed under awnings and porches, muttering curses at the storm, their eyes drifting toward the square where the auctioneer shouted over the thunder. His voice was sharp, grating, and yet it carried, bouncing off the sagging buildings that framed the market yard. "Lot 11!" he bellowed, slamming his gavel against the block as though striking judgment itself. "Widow and 5 strong boys. Good backs, good hands, a package deal." Gasps and nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Some men shook their heads, others laughed openly. Women whispered behind shawls pulled tight against the weather. Children gawked, wide-eyed at the spectacle. There she stood, Clara Devlin, shoulders straight, jaw locked tight, as if sheer willpower could shield her and her children from the degradation. Her dress clung to her frame, soaked through, dark with rain. One arm wrapped around the youngest, a small boy no more than 4, pressed close against her skirts. The other 4 huddled behind her like fence posts after a storm, worn, upright, half broken but still standing. She did not cry. She did not beg. But the auctioneer's words cut, like knives just the same. "Widow," he spat the word like it was filth. "5 mouths that'll eat you out of house and home unless you put 'em to work. Now who'll start me at $20? A bark of laughter came from under the saloon porch. "You mean, to tell us we can buy a woman and her brats like cattle now?" "That's what he said," another voice jeered. "Ain't worth half that, unless you want headaches and empty plates." The widow's chin lifted higher. The boys shrank further into her skirts. Across the muddy street, Rhett Langston reined in his bay gelding. He had not come to town for this, hadn't planned on stopping at all. He'd trailed 200 head of lean longhorns from the river bottom, intending to push them north with the railhead buyers. He wanted only a hot meal, a dry bed, maybe whiskey enough to ease the loneliness that had followed him for years. But the storm had driven him here, and the sight before him rooted him to the saddle. Her face, drawn but proud. The smallest boy clinging to her, his tiny fists twisted in her skirt. The auctioneer jabbing a fat finger at them like they were livestock. Rhett's jaw tightened. His hands, scarred and calloused from years of rope and rain, curled into fists on the saddle horn. $15? The auctioneer pressed, scanning the crowd. 10? Come now, gentlemen. There's 5 strong backs here. Think of the work they'll do for you. A man spat into the mud. I'll give you 5 just to take 'em off. Your hands. Laughter exploded again, ugly and coarse. The widow did not move. She kept her head high, though her cheeks flushed hot against the rain. Rhett swung down from the saddle, boots sinking into the muck. He strode across the square, the storm lashing against his coat. Mud splashed up his legs, but he barely noticed. The auctioneer sneered. "Well now, Mr. Langston, didn't think you had a taste for charity." "I'll take them," Rhett said flatly. The words silenced the square. The laughter choked off. Even the thunder seemed to hesitate. The widow's eyes widened, though she said nothing. The smallest boy buried his face against her side. "You'll take them?" the auctioneer echoed, stunned. Rhett pulled a leather pouch from his coat and tossed it onto the block. The coins clinked loud enough for everyone to hear. "That'll cover it." The auctioneer fumbled the pouch, greed overtaking surprise. "Sold," he declared, slamming the gavel down hard. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. Langston's lost his mind. What's he want with a widow and 5 mouths to feed? He ain't been right, since he buried his wife and little girl. Rhett ignored them. He turned to the widow, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. For a long moment, they stared at one another. 2 lives colliding in a storm neither had sought. "Mom," he said finally, his voice low, almost rough. "Come with me." The widow's lips parted, but no words came. She gathered her, boys tighter, her pride warring with her desperation. The storm howled around them, drowning the town in a grey curtain of rain. And then, without asking permission or offering comfort, Rhett turned and walked toward his waiting horse. He did not look back to see if she followed. For a heartbeat, Clara Devlin stood frozen in the muck, her sons clutching at her skirts. The square buzzed with whispers, the crowd hungry for spectacle. Shame burned her cheeks, but in the end, she lifted her chin once more. "Come, boys," she whispered, her voice trembling only at the edges. "We'll go." One by one, they stepped forward, following her through the rain after the stranger who had bought them. Not as cattle, not as servants, but as something else entirely. What that was, none of them yet knew. But before nightfall, one of those, boys would call him something Rhett had not heard in years, something that cut deeper than the storm, Pa. The ride to Rhett Langston's ranch stretched long across sodden plains, the storm finally breaking as dusk bled into night. The widow and her 5 boys followed behind on a rickety wagon Rhett had traded a pair of steers for months ago, half rotten but still rolling. Clara held the reins with stiff hands, her sons clumped beside her on the bench, silent as shadows. Rhett rode ahead, the brim of his hat pulled low, saying nothing. His silence weighed heavier than the storm had. The Langston place rose out of the prairie like a half-forgotten relic. A clapboard house with sagging shutters, a barn leaning against the wind, fences broken in stretches, corrals gone to weeds. It looked less like a working ranch and more like a graveyard of ambitions. Clara's breath caught at the sight. This was no homecoming. This was exile. Rhett swung down, boots crunching gravel. He tied his gelding to the post and glanced back at her. "Unload," he said simply. Then he strode toward the barn without another word. Clara stiffened. "Come, boys," she murmured, climbing from the wagon. She helped the youngest, Matthew, down, then guided Samuel, Jesse, Eli, and Thomas after. Each boy carried what little they had: a threadbare blanket, a chipped tin cup, a bundle of clothes that smelled of smoke and rain. Inside, the house was dark, musty, and cold. Cobwebs clung to the rafters, dust coated the table and chairs. Clara ran her hand across the mantel and left a trail in the grime. "This ain't fit for living," Jesse muttered, his voice sharp for a boy of 12. "Hush," Clara said quickly. "We'll make it fit." She busied herself, setting the boys to sweeping, scrubbing, hauling water. It wasn't pride. That drove her. It was survival. She would not allow Rhett Langston or anyone else to think she and her sons were useless mouths. By the time the lamps were lit and the first fire stoked, Rhett returned from the barn. He paused in the doorway, watching the widow direct her sons. Samuel, the oldest at 14, bent his back to carrying wood. Eli scrubbed the table till it shone. Even little Matthew tried to stir the ashes into flame, his cheeks smudged with soot. Clara looked up, her eyes catching Rhett's in the flickering light. There was no gratitude in her expression, only determination. "I won't owe you," she said, voice low but steady. "We'll earn our keep." Rhett grunted. "Didn't ask for thanks." He pulled off his coat, hung it on the peg, and took a seat at the table. For a long while he just sat there, staring into the flames, as though lost somewhere she couldn't reach. That first night passed in silence. The boys curled together on pallets laid across the floor, their mother beside them, one hand resting protectively over Matthew's small back. Rhett remained in his chair until the fire burned low, his eyes open long after theirs had closed. Morning came gray and brittle. Roosters crowed weakly from somewhere beyond the barn. The prairie glistened with the remnants of last night's storm. Clara roused her sons early. "Chores first," she said, pressing bread crusts into their hands. "We'll show him we're not a burden." They worked hard that day. Samuel helped repair the corral rails. Jesse mucked the stalls. Eli fetched water from the creek, though his shoulders sagged under the yoke. Thomas, only 7, gathered kindling with grim resolve. Matthew toddled behind, tripping in the mud, but refusing to be left behind. Clara scrubbed the floors, aired the quilts, cooked what little she could from flour and beans she found in the pantry. Her back ached, her fingers burned raw from the lye soap, but she pushed through. Rhett watched in silence. He didn't stop them, didn't offer direction, didn't interfere. But when Jesse cut his palm on a splintered rail, it was Rhett who came forward with a strip of clean cloth. He wrapped the boy's hand with surprising gentleness, his rough voice low. "Keep it clean. It'll heal." Jesse blinked up at him, startled, then muttered, "Yes, sir." Clara saw it. The small flicker of something soft buried beneath Rhett's silence. A patience she hadn't expected. That evening, while supper simmered, little Matthew crawled into Rhett's lap without asking. The boy's curls brushed against Rhett's chin as he peered up with wide eyes. "Pa," he whispered sleepily. The word landed like a hammer in Rhett's chest. His breath caught, and for an instant, his face twisted, raw grief flashing behind his eyes. Clara froze, spoon trembling in her hand. The other boys went still, watching. Rhett set Matthew down gently, his jaw tight. He said nothing, only pushed, back from the table and stepped out into the yard, where the night wind carried the scent of wet sage and dust. Clara's heart clenched. She knew that look. She'd worn it herself the day they'd buried her husband. But for all her sympathy, she would not let her boys grow too attached. Not yet. "Finish your supper," she told them firmly. "And mind your words." Still, deep down, she wondered, had that single word cracked open something in the hardened cattleman? Or had it simply torn at wounds that never healed? Later, when the fire burned low again, Clara stepped onto the porch. Rhett leaned against the post, hat low, pipe smoke curling into the dark. "You don't owe me," he said suddenly, without looking at her. "I know." Her voice was quiet. "But I'll see my boys are worth something here." He nodded once, as though satisfied. Then silence reclaimed the night. Yet beneath that silence, Clara felt it, a faint shift, like the prairie itself drawing breath. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something neither of them could name. The days that followed rolled into a rhythm, as steady and stubborn as the prairie wind. Clara kept her boys busy, patching holes in fences, tending to the kitchen garden, sweeping dust that always found its way back by sundown. Rhett remained, a figure of few words, present but distant. He ate at the table with them, worked the cattle by day, and often sat late into the night, staring into the flames as though listening to voices no one else could hear. Clara told herself she didn't mind the silence. She'd lived with worse, with the drunken rants of her late husband, with neighbors who sneered at her misfortune. At least here, in this place, silence felt safe. But safety had a way of being tested. It came first in the form of sickness. Thomas, the second youngest, woke one morning pale and clammy, his forehead hot as a branding iron. He coughed until his small chest heaved and his eyes glazed with fever. Clara's heart pounded as she pressed a damp cloth to his brow, whispering prayers she'd whispered too many times before. Rhett appeared in the doorway, his face shadowed. "What is it?" "Fever," Clara said, her voice tight. "He needs cool air, water, rest." Rhett stepped forward, kneeling beside the boy. His large hand rested lightly against Thomas's forehead. He nodded once. "I'll ride for Willowbark. Kane keeps some in his shed by the creek." Clara blinked. Kane? That lawyer? Was a lawyer. Now he's just an old drunk with herbs and books. Rhett was already reaching for his hat. He knows enough. He was gone before she could protest. Hours later, he returned, soaked with sweat, carrying the bitter bark and a bottle of laudanum. Together, he and Clara nursed Thomas through the night, Rhett steady as stone, Clara trembling but unyielding. By dawn, the fever broke. The boy slept, cheeks flushed but breathing easy. Clara sagged against the wall, exhausted. Rhett lingered by the bed, his eyes softening as he looked at Thomas, then at her. "You fought for him," he said quietly. Clara bristled. "He's my boy. I'll always fight." Something flickered in Rhett's expression, a memory she could not see. He rose, adjusted the blanket, and left without another word. But sickness was only the beginning. A week later, Clara made her first trip into town since the auction. She needed flour and salt. The boys trailed her, their heads down, wary of the stares that followed. Whispers rippled through the mercantile. "That's the one Langston bought. Parading her brats like she's a lady. Shameful, selling herself and her kin." Clara kept her chin high, but her hands trembled as she counted out coins for the flour. When she turned, she found herself face to face with Sheriff Edges. "Mrs. Devlin," the sheriff drawled, his belly straining against his vest. "Or should I say, Widow Devlin. Thing is, we never did receive a death certificate for your late husband. Officially, far as the law's concerned, he may still be alive." Clara's throat went dry. "He's dead, buried outside Abilene." "Maybe so, maybe not." The sheriff's eyes gleamed with something oily. "But without paper, folks could say you're no widow at all. And that makes your arrangement with Langston questionable." Jessie bristled beside her. "Leave her be." The sheriff's gaze snapped to the boy, cold as a rattler's. "Careful, son. You'll learn quick this town don't care for backtalk." Rhett's voice cut through the air like a whip. "That's enough." Clara spun. He stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room like thunderclouds, his eyes locked on the sheriff's. "You got something worth saying, Edges. Say it plain." The sheriff shifted, uneasy, just keeping the law in mind. He tipped his hat, but the smirk never left his lips. "See to it you do the same." Then he left, the mercantile buzzing in his wake. Clara's cheeks burned with humiliation, but also gratitude. Rhett stepped closer, his jaw tight. "They'll use any excuse to shame you," he said, voice low. "Best be ready." "I have been ready," Clara shot back, her pride raw. But even as she spoke, she knew his words were warning, not insult. The warning proved true soon enough. That evening, Eli came home with torn trousers and a split lip. Clara's heart sank as she knelt, wiping the blood from his chin. "Who did this?" she demanded. "Boys from town," Eli muttered. "Said Pa left us 'cause Ma was too proud. Said we ain't got no real home." Clara's vision blurred, with fury. But before she could speak, Rhett knelt beside Eli, his hand steady on the boy's shoulder. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "Their words don't make them right. Don't let them turn you bitter. You're worth more than their spite." Eli's eyes widened. For the first time, he didn't look at Rhett like a stranger. He nodded slowly, the hardness in his face softening just a little. Clara saw it again, the quiet patience Rhett carried. The way he bore shame and mockery not with words, but with a steadiness that anchored those around him. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Clara stepped onto the porch. Rhett leaned there, smoking his pipe, the prairie stretching dark. Around them. "They won't stop, will they?" she asked softly. "No." His voice was calm, almost resigned. "But they don't matter. Not if you know who you are." "And who am I, Mr. Langston?" His gaze shifted to hers, steady and unflinching. "You're a woman who stood in the rain with 5 boys and didn't break. That's more than most men I've ever known." Clara's breath caught. She turned away, not trusting her voice. Inside, her son slept soundly, but in her chest, something. Restless stirred, fear, pride, and something else she dared not name. The weeks of hard work began to knit something unspoken between them. Clara and her boys were no longer strangers rattling around an empty house. They were becoming a presence, filling Rhett's ranch with the noise of chores, laughter in fleeting bursts. and the quiet determination of survival. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. It began with a drunken hand at the saloon. Rhett had ridden into Dunn's Crossing for supplies, Clara's list folded in his pocket. The air inside stank of whiskey and sweat, men shouting over card games while the barkeep wiped glasses with a rag dirtier than the floor. As Rhett passed, a tall ranch hand named Murdoch sneered. "How's your brood, Langston? That widow keeping your bed warm yet?" The words landed hard in the room, laughter erupting like a spark to dry grass. Rhett stopped. He turned, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. "Mind your tongue," Murdoch rose, swaying on his feet. "Why should I? You think buying yourself a woman and her brats makes you some kind of saint? To me, looks like desperation." The room went silent. Cards froze mid-air. Even the barkeep held his breath. Rhett's voice dropped, low and dangerous. "Say another word, and you'll chew it with broken teeth." Murdoch lunged, but Rhett was faster. His fist cracked against the man's jaw with the force of a hammer. Murdoch crashed to the floor, spitting blood. Rhett didn't wait for applause or for the fight to escalate. He tossed coins on the counter, gathered his supplies, and left without another word. But the damage was done. By sundown, half the town was muttering about Rhett Langston and the widow he'd bought, the gossip twisting like barbed wire around every porch and saloon table. That night, Clara found him on the porch, jaw bruised, knuckles raw. "You fought," she said quietly, her eyes narrowing. "I protected what's mine," Rhett answered. Clara stiffened. "We are not yours." His gaze flicked to her then, sharp and unwavering. "No. But you are under my roof, and I won't let anyone shame you for it." Her breath caught. She turned away before he could see the war in her expression. Gratitude tangled with fear, pride laced with something warmer. The true test came. Days later, when fire lit the night. Jesse was the first to smell it, smoke curling through the cracks of the bunkhouse, sharp and bitter. He shook Samuel awake, then bolted outside, shouting. The barn was ablaze, flames clawing high into the sky, devouring dry timber with a roar like the end of the world. The cattle bellowed in terror inside. "Pa!" Jesse screamed before he even thought about it. Rhett was already running, bareheaded, hauling buckets from the well. Clara rushed out with the younger boys, eyes wide with horror. "Stay back!" Rhett shouted. "Get them clear!" But Jesse didn't stay back. He dashed toward the barn door, determined to free the animals. Heat blasted his face, the crackle of burning wood nearly deafening. Rhett caught him by the collar and yanked him aside. "You'll die in there." "Then let me help." Jesse shouted back, coughing in the smoke. For a split second, Rhett saw himself, not as he was, but as he'd once been, pulling his wife and daughter from a wagon that burned after a lantern overturned. He'd failed then. He would not fail. "Now, on my word," he growled, thrusting a wet cloth into Jesse's hands. "We do this together." Side by side, man and boy plunged into the choking smoke. They threw open stalls, driving cattle out into the night, hacking and coughing, until their throats burned raw. When the last calf stumbled free, the roof gave way with a scream of collapsing timbers. They barely made it out alive, the barn crashing behind them in a storm of sparks. Clara rushed forward, pulling Jesse into her arms, her hands shaking as she checked him over. Rhett stood nearby, chest heaving, face streaked with soot, his shirt clinging with sweat. The cattle were saved, the barn lost. The boys clung to their mother, their eyes wide with terror, and yet, when they looked at Rhett, it wasn't fear that filled their gazes, it was awe. Later, when the flames died to embers, Clara approached him. Her voice trembled with exhaustion. "You risked your life." "So did Jesse," Rhett said simply. She swallowed hard. "Why?" He met her gaze, and for the first time his voice cracked. "Because I couldn't lose another family. The truth, hit like a blow. Clara's breath caught, her heart thundering in her chest. She wanted to ask more, but the words withered on her lips. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you." Rhett nodded once, turning back to the smoldering ruins. His shoulders sagged, but in the flicker of firelight, something shifted between them, an unspoken vow forged in smoke and fear. Inside the house, the boys whispered in their pallets, wide awake despite their mother's urging to rest. Samuel glanced at his brothers, then at the door where Rhett's shadow loomed. "He saved us," he murmured. "He saved the cattle too," Jesse added, voice thick. Little Matthew, thumb in his mouth, whispered the word again, soft but certain. "Pa." And this time, none of his brothers corrected him. The barn fire had left more than ashes. It left an unspoken bond. In the days that followed, Clara noticed subtle changes, fragile as spring buds breaking through frost. The boys began to watch Rhett with different eyes. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was something closer to trust. Jesse, once defiant, lingered near Rhett when chores were done, his questions blunt but genuine. "How do you break a colt? How do you mend a fence so it won't sag?" Rhett answered simply, showing rather than telling. Samuel, cautious and steady, began shouldering more responsibility without being asked, as though he'd taken Rhett's example to heart. Even Eli, the quick-tempered one, sought Rhett's approval after splitting logs straighter than his brother. And little Matthew, he no longer hesitated to climb into Rhett's lap, curling against the cattleman's chest as if he had belonged there all along. At first, Clara tried to stop it. "You'll confuse them," she warned one evening, her voice sharp, though her hands trembled as she kneaded bread. Rhett leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "Confuse them how?" "They have a father. He's gone, but he was theirs." Rhett's eyes darkened, though his voice stayed calm. "And what am I then? Just the man who bought them at an auction?" Her breath hitched. She turned back to the dough, blinking against sudden heat in her eyes. "I don't know what you are." He said nothing, only pushed away from the frame and left her to the silence. But later that night she found the boys asleep, and Rhett had pulled blankets over them with careful hands before settling into his chair by the fire. It was then she realized he might not know what he was to them either, but the boys had already begun to decide. Word of the fire spread quickly through Dunn's Crossing. Some said Rhett had saved the cattle like a true rancher. Others whispered Strickland's name, suspecting his hired hands had set the blaze to drive Rhett off his land. The sheriff came sniffing around, leaning in the doorway with that smug grin Clara loathed. "Shame about your barn, Langston," Edges said. "Place like this ain't fit for raising stock anymore. Best sell while you still got cattle worth a dime." Rhett didn't flinch. "Not selling." The sheriff's gaze slid to Clara, then the boys. "Funny arrangement you've got here. Some folks think it don't look right. A widow living under your roof without a paper saying she's yours." Clara's cheeks burned. She drew herself up, ready to strike back with words sharper than knives, but Rhett cut her off. "They're mine in all but name. If the town don't like it, they can choke on it." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You'll regret saying that." He spat in the dirt and sauntered off. Clara's heart hammered as she turned on Rhett. "You'll make enemies we can't afford." "They were enemies already," he said simply, his gaze steady. "Best the boys see a man stand for them." That evening, as twilight painted the prairie in shades of gold and gray, Clara watched from the porch as Rhett taught Jesse to throw a rope. Samuel held the coiled line, Eli clapped when the loop caught, and even Thomas laughed when the rope tumbled over his small shoulders. She saw something she had thought long buried, a family taking shape, not by blood, not by law, but by choice. Her throat tightened. She remembered standing in the square, the rain soaking her to the bone, shame crushing her like a stone. She had thought that moment her end. But now, watching her boys' faces light with rare joy, she wondered if it had been a beginning. The moment of naming came days later. Rhett had spent the morning mending a section of fence when Samuel approached, carrying a bucket of nails. He lingered, shifting from foot to foot. "You need something?" Rhett asked. Samuel swallowed hard, then blurted, "I can call you Pa, can't I?" Rhett froze, hammer midair. He turned slowly, searching the boy's face. Samuel's eyes were steady, if nervous, his jaw set in the stubborn way Rhett had seen before. "You don't have to," Rhett said, voice rough. "I want to." The hammer lowered. For a moment, Rhett couldn't find his voice. Then he nodded once. "If that's what you want, son." The word slipped out. "Son." And Samuel's face broke into a smile brighter than Rhett had ever seen. From that day forward, the others followed. Jesse said it in a mutter the next evening, as though testing the word. Eli shouted it across the yard when Rhett hoisted him onto a horse. Even Thomas, small and shy, whispered it like a secret. And when Matthew said it again, climbing into Rhett's lap with a grin, Rhett didn't flinch this time. He wrapped his arms around the boy and held him close. Clara saw it, all her heart swelling and breaking in equal measure. She feared what the world would say, what the law might strip away. But when she looked at her boys, their faces softer, their laughter freer, she knew she could not stop it. That night, she found Rhett on the porch again, staring at the stars. "They've claimed you," she said quietly. His gaze stayed on the horizon. "I didn't ask for it." "No," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "But you needed it, and so did they." For a long time, silence hung between them, heavy but not empty. The kind of silence that carried the weight of belonging. Summer bled into a parched, merciless autumn. The prairie, once green with promise, shriveled beneath the sun's relentless eye. Grass turned brittle, water holes dried to mud, and cattle ribs began to show. Every day Clara woke to the same sight, dust rolling like smoke across the horizon, choking the land. Rhett rose earlier than ever, riding fence lines, pushing cattle toward what little grass still clung to life. Samuel rode with him now, his shoulders straighter, his hands more confident on the reins. Jesse and Eli hauled water, Thomas gathered kindling, Matthew tottered after them, determined to be useful. But no matter how hard they worked, the drought bit deeper. One evening, Clara found Rhett in the barn, staring at the dwindling sacks of grain. His shirt clung with sweat, his face shadowed with exhaustion. "We'll have to sell half the herd," he muttered, more to himself than her. Her throat tightened. "And the other half?" He rubbed a hand across his jaw. "If rain don't come, they'll die anyway." The words cut like knives. She thought of her boys, their bellies already thinner, their cheeks hollowing. She stepped closer, voice trembling but fierce. "Then we'll find a way. We've all lived through worse." Rhett's eyes lifted to hers, weary but burning. "I won't see them starve." "You won't," she said, steadying him as much as herself. "Not while I've breath." The weeks that followed tested them all. Clara rationed meals with ruthless precision, stretching beans and flour into thin gruel, saving scraps for the boys even when her own stomach ached. Rhett hauled water from a creek 2 miles out, shoulders bowed under the yoke. Samuel worked beside him without complaint. Jesse fought weeds in the dry garden, Eli fetched wood, Thomas scoured the prairie for berries. One night, Clara caught Rhett slipping a portion of his bread onto Samuel's plate. "You'll waste away," she scolded softly. "I've wasted away before," he answered. "They need it more." Her chest tightened, and for a moment she wanted to reach for his hand. But she didn't. Not yet. The drought wasn't the only trial. Strickland, the wealthy rancher who'd long hated Rhett, saw opportunity in their hardship. He rode up with his men one afternoon, their horses kicking up dust, their sneers sharp. "As knives, Langston," Strickland called. his voice slick with mockery. "Heard your cattle are dying. Thought I'd come buy your land before it's worth nothing." Rhett stepped forward, body taut as a drawn bow. "Not for sale." Strickland's eyes slid to Clara, who stood on the porch with her boys clustered around her. "A shame. Pretty widow, all those mouths to feed. You'd do better under a man who can provide?" Clara stiffened, her face burning. Before she could answer, Rhett's voice cut like steel. "You'll leave this place," he growled, hand resting on the butt of his Colt. Strickland smirked, but there was something in Rhett's stance that made even his hired guns hesitate. With a sneer, he turned his horse. "This ain't over, Langston, not by a mile." The boys watched, wide-eyed, their small bodies trembling. Clara pulled them close, her heart pounding. She met Rhett's gaze across the yard, and in that moment, the truth settled over her like a mantle. He wasn't just defending land or cattle, he was defending them. The drought broke in violence. One evening, dark clouds gathered like a promise, thunder rolling low across the plains. Relief swept through the ranch until lightning struck the far pasture. Flames leapt, whipped wild by the wind. "The herd!" Rhett shouted, grabbing his saddle. The boys scrambled after him. Clara's hands shook as she held Matthew tight. "Stay here," she told the younger ones. But Samuel and Jesse were already running, determined not to be left behind. They reached the pasture in time to see fire racing through dry grass. The cattle panicked, surging toward the flames. Rhett's voice roared above the chaos. "Drive 'em south! Keep 'em clear!" Samuel and Jesse rode hard, their small bodies jolting in the saddles. Fear etched on their faces, but determination burning stronger. Together with Rhett, they turned the herd, shouting, waving, risking hooves and fire to push the cattle away from death. At the edge of the inferno, Jesse's horse stumbled. The boy tumbled to the ground, the fire closing fast. "Jesse!" Clara's scream tore across the field. Rhett was already there, leaping from his horse, dragging the boy up with one arm, shielding him with his own body as sparks scorched the air. With a surge of strength, he hurled Jesse onto his mount and slapped the horse forward, flames licking at his boots as he climbed back into the saddle. They escaped the blaze barely intact, clothes singed, lungs raw from smoke. But the herd lived, the ranch saved. For now. That night, after the storm finally poured rain over the charred earth, Clara found Rhett sitting alone beneath the cottonwood tree, rain dripping from his hat brim. "You'd risk everything," she whispered, his eyes lifted to hers, full of shadows but also something unguarded. "For them. For you." Her breath caught. She sank beside him, their shoulders brushing. For a long moment they sat in silence, rain washing the soot from their skin. Then Clara reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. The world around them was harsh, unforgiving. But in that quiet vow, sealed in rain and firelight, something tender bloomed, fragile, yet unbreakable. The rain that saved the cattle washed the land clean, but it couldn't wash away Strickland's malice. He struck back not with fire, but with the law. One morning Sheriff Edges rode up with 2 deputies and a folded paper in his fist. Clara was hanging laundry, her boys chasing one another across the yard. Rhett was oiling tack on the porch when Edges called out, "Langston, Widow Devlin, court's called in South Bend. Judge Treadwell himself says your arrangement ain't legal. Woman with no proof of widowhood, boys with no guardianship. You're to appear, else the children will be taken by the county." Clara froze, the wet sheet clutched in her hands. The boys went still, like rabbits sensing a hawk. Rhett's jaw tightened. "They're mine." "Not by law," the sheriff sneered. "By law, they're strays, and Strickland's offering to place them in respectable homes." Clara's knees weakened, but Rhett stepped forward, his voice flat and final. "We'll be there." The days before the hearing were taut with dread. Clara packed the boys' best clothes, though they were still patched and worn. Rhett cleaned himself up, trimming his beard, his hat brushed neat. Cain, the drunken hermit Rhett had fetched willow bark from weeks before, staggered out of his shack sober for the first time in years, carrying a battered satchel of law books. Thought. "I was done with courtrooms," Cain muttered, eyes bloodshot but sharp. "But you stood by me once, Langston. I'll stand by you now." The journey to South Bend felt like a funeral march. Clara rode in silence, her boys huddled close, her heart pounding with every hoofbeat. Rhett rode beside them, grim and steady. The courthouse loomed large and cold, its walls stone gray against the prairie sky. Inside, the benches were full, townsfolk, ranchers, even children craning to watch. The gossip had spread wide. Langston, the cattleman gone half mad, trying to claim a widow and her brats as his own. Judge Treadwell presided, his robe heavy, his eyes harder. Strickland sat smug near the front, flanked by his lawyers. The hearing opened with accusations. "This woman," Strickland's man declared, "has lied about her husband's death. Without papers, she cannot prove widowhood. These children are wards of the state. Langston has no claim." Clara sat rigid, her hands trembling in her lap. The boys leaned against her, Samuel squeezing her hand. Then Cain rose, surprisingly steady, his voice carrying like a whip crack. "You speak of papers, but what of deeds? Rhett Langston put food in these boys' mouths, a roof over their heads. He pulled them from fire and sickness. If law's meant to protect the weak, then tell me, who here has done more?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Treadwell scowled. "This court requires evidence, not sentiment." Clara's throat tightened. Evidence. What evidence could she give? She had no papers, no letters, nothing but her word. When her turn came, she stood, her voice shaking but clear. "My husband is gone," she said. "Buried where no marker stands, because the world gave me nothing to bury him with. These are my sons. I would rather have died in that square than let them be torn apart. Rhett Langston saved us, not because he needed workers, not because he sought a wife, but because he couldn't stand to see us broken. That may not be law, Your Honor, but it is family." Silence fell. Even Treadwell shifted uneasily, but Strickland was not finished. He rose, his voice oily. "Family, you say? Or ambition? Langston seeks to rebuild his ruined life, and he'll use your pity to do it. But the law cannot bend for pity. These children deserve better." The room buzzed, tension thick. Clara felt her knees weaken, despair gnawing at her resolve. Then Rhett stood. He hadn't spoken until now, but when he did, the room hushed. "I buried my wife and daughter years ago," he said, voice raw but steady. "Since then, this house, this land, it's been a grave. Empty, silent. When I saw that woman stand in the rain, proud though the world spat on her, I saw more courage than I've seen in any man. I didn't buy cattle that day. I bought a chance to fight for life again." His eyes swept the room, blazing. "If you strip them from me, you'll not just break her, you'll break me, and I'll tell you plain, I won't let it stand." Phi. Words hung in the air like thunder. The judge's gavel slammed, but the crowd's whispers surged, some in shock, some in approval. Outside, as the court recessed, Clara pressed her hand to Rhett's arm. Her voice trembled. "You said more than I ever could." He looked down at her, eyes shadowed. "Truth don't always matter to men like Treadwell, but it matters to me." Her heart twisted. In that moment, she saw the weight he carried, not just for himself, but for her boys, for her. And though fear still gnawed, hope glimmered like the first light after storm. The final ruling was delayed. Strickland pushed for another hearing, this time under a different judge in the county seat. For now, the family was spared, but the threat lingered like a wolf at the edge of camp. On the ride home, Samuel leaned against Rhett, his voice soft but steady. "Don't worry, Pa. We'll stay together." Rhett's throat tightened. He ruffled the boy's hair, saying nothing, but inside, the vow burned bright. Whatever came, they would face it as one. The weeks before the second hearing were a strain on every soul in the household. Clara tried to keep life steady, chores done, meals stretched, boys schooled by lamplight, but each day felt like waiting for the hangman's bell. Rhett worked, harder than ever, jaw set, shoulders heavy, as though the land itself pressed against him. Cain studied long into the night, muttering over law books older than most of the town. Clara heard him through thin walls, his voice hoarse with drink and desperation. Yet when morning came, his hands were steady. At last, they traveled to the county seat of South Bend. Unlike Dunn's Crossing, South Bend's courthouse bore less of Strickland's influence. The new judge, a stern but measured man named Aldridge, listened without the contempt Treadwell had shown. Still, Strickland's lawyers came armed with venom. "This woman has no proof of widowhood," they repeated. "This man no right of guardianship. Without papers, their so-called family is a fraud." Cain rose slowly, his frame hunched, but his voice rang clear. "Fraud is a man who sets fire to barns to drive a neighbor from his land. Fraud is a rancher who whispers lies in saloons while children go hungry. Tell me, gentlemen, which family is false? The one built on cruelty or the one built on survival?" The courtroom murmured. Strickland's face flushed red. Then Clara was called to speak. She walked forward, her dress plain but her posture proud. Her voice trembled only at first. "You ask for papers. I have none. All I have is truth. My boys were mine by birth. But they are Rhett Langston's by choice. He carried them from sickness, from fire, from the scorn of neighbors. He gave us not just shelter, but dignity. Family is not sealed by ink. It is sealed by sacrifice." Her eyes glistened, but her voice never wavered. "If the law cannot see that, then the law is blind." The judge leaned forward, fingers steepled. For a long moment, silence stretched. Then his gavel struck once. "This court recognizes the marriage of Rhett Langston and Clara Devlin and grants guardianship of the children. They are henceforth to be regarded as one family, under both law and name." Gasps rippled through the room. Clara's knees weakened with relief. Rhett's shoulders sagged, the weight finally slipping away. Samuel squeezed Jesse's hand. Eli grinned for the first time in weeks, and little Matthew shouted, "Pa!" loud enough to echo against the walls. Strickland stormed out, his defeat a bitter wound. Back at the ranch, the air felt lighter, the ground steadier. The boys ran free across the pasture, shouting and laughing, their faces bright. Clara stood beneath the cottonwood tree, the same one where Rhett had once brooded in silence, and watched them. Rhett came to her side, his hat in his hands. For a moment, they simply stood together, listening to the sound of children's laughter on the wind. Then he spoke, voice low but certain. "We should make it proper." Clara turned to him, brows drawn. "Proper." He nodded. "A marriage, not for law, for us, for them." Her throat tightened. She thought of the rain-soaked auction block, the humiliation, the despair. She thought of fire and drought, of whispered slurs and courtroom battles. And she thought of the quiet strength he had given her boys, the shelter he had become. Tears brimmed as she whispered, "Yes." They married beneath that cottonwood. The boys gathered close, Cain standing witness with a rare smile. No preacher, no crowd, only vows spoken soft, promises made without flourish. Rhett's hands trembled as he took hers, but his voice was steady. "I lost my family once," he said. "I thought I'd never have another. But God saw fit to give me you. I'll spend whatever years I've left proving worthy of it." Clara's reply was simple, but her eyes shone. "You've already proven it. Every day." When he kissed her, the boys whooped and laughed. Jesse pretending to gag, until Eli punched his shoulder. For the first time, the ranch rang not with silence or grief, but with joy. The years rolled on. Seasons turned, storms came and went, and the Langston ranch endured. Rhett taught Samuel and Jesse to ride herd, to brand, to rope. Eli discovered a gift for carving, his wooden figures lining the mantel. Thomas grew steady and strong, while Matthew, still the boldest, never stopped calling Rhett Pa. Clara kept the house alive with warmth, her garden blooming each spring, her bread filling the rooms with comfort. She aged with grace, her eyes still proud, her back never bending. And Rhett, scarred, weathered, softened by love, found peace he had long thought impossible. He sat many evenings beneath the cottonwood, Clara's hand in his, the boys laughing in the distance. When at last his time came, years later, they laid him beneath that same tree. The stone bore only his name, but above it, Clara carved words. With her own hand, he gave us everything. And though the West remained harsh, unfair, and unforgiving, on that ranch stood proof that chosen family could outlast fire, famine, and even death. A widow once sold in shame, 5 boys once fatherless, and a man once broken in grief had built something the prairie could never take, a legacy of belonging.